So now we're going to get off into healing-centered engagement versus trauma-informed care, and not versus as in one against the other or one over the other, but comparatively in how they complement each other. Trauma-informed care is both an organizational structure and treatment framework that involves understanding, recognizing, and responding to the effects of all types of diagnosed and even undiagnosed trauma. But yet, healing-centered engagement is holistic, involving culture, spirituality, civic engagement, and collective healing to restore a person's sense of being. When we talked about that earlier, a sense of self, a sense of being, giving them a cultural and holistic outlet to cope with their trauma and heal from its effects. How does healing-centered engagement work? The healing-centered approach, it views trauma not as an individual isolated experience. Highlights the ways trauma and healing are experienced collectively, meaning that how the community shares in that same trauma. So when we talk about violence in our community, we're talking about that shared experience. We're not just talking about how that one individual child and that immediate child's family was impacted, but how we as a whole have a shared sense of connection to this collective violence in our community that impacts all of us as a whole. So it becomes a collective approach to it as well. It highlights the ways trauma and healing are experienced collectively, offers an asset-driven approach aimed at the holistic restoration of young people's well-being, uses the opposing question of what happened to you, which is what, oftentimes in trauma we talk about today. What happened to you? Instead, we say, what's right with you, right? So when a child is experiencing trauma in their lives and sense of shame and guilt, for example, we try to center them slightly for a moment away from what happened to you. Okay, so let's talk about what's right with you right now, right? Let's find something to center you, to give you a sense of self-worth, as we then double back to the trauma, to what caused the trauma. Because you can usually build around yourselves and your strengths. It's hard to build from weakness, right? From the trauma that's impacting. When you can identify strengths in your life, right? And I remember when I was incarcerated, I used to do this thing that I used to take a piece of paper and draw it in half. And I used to do this to compare my spiritual worth, right? And versus my physical value, the things I place physical value on, like materialism. So I draw a piece of paper in my prison cell. I would say, let me list all of the things on one side of the paper that was materialistic, like a television, a radio, right? The things that were considered materialistic, my tennis shoes, I played basketball, and I took pride in wanting to play ball in, right? And then on the other piece of paper, I wrote down all the things that I invested in my spiritual growth, such as my books, right? My journals, my manuscripts, how many times I prayed throughout the day, for example, or what my weekly schedule was like to go to the chapel and things of that nature. Like I used to compare them, right, to see where I was stronger at. And I would tell other people to do the same thing, to see where you're strong at. Right? And so when you can identify places where you're strong at, or even places where you're weak at, then you can supplement and start to remove things and begin to build around perhaps where you're weak at with where you should be strong at. So it's the same kind of approach. So the pathways to restoring well-being. Healing-centered engagement is culturally grounded, views healing as the restoration of well-being through identity. Right? And we're going to talk about why that's important in just when I finish reading these. Rooting young people in a solid sense of meaning, self and perception and purpose, highlighting shared or collective identity such as race or ethnic value, gender, and sexual orientation. The reason why this is critical because historically, African Americans, as I mentioned earlier, have a sense of self-worth that is undervalued, that is devalued, and has been passed down generationally. So when you're able to counter that and tell a young person, like we tell young women today, young black girls today particularly, we tell them, you're beautiful. Just as black as you are, just as kinky as your hair is, your thick legs or thick thighs, or your thick lips or your nose, or however you are shaped, you're beautiful just as you are. We reinforce a sense of self-worth in that individual, right? We do that with young black boys too. So today, you'll hear a lot of African Americans in the community calling each other kings and queens to give them a sense of self-worth because they've been told that they were descendants of slaves who never contributed to humanity. who weren't purveyors of civilization and science and architecture and etc., right? Who've been told that historically. So they have no sense of self-worth. So if you don't know where you've been and what you've created, you don't know where you're going and what you can create or how great you can become. So healing-centered approach wants to recenter that and who you are and a sense of value of yourself. So how we build that model, right? So building the healing-centered engagement model, we start by building empathy, right? We start by building empathy, leading to a trusting connection, right? By sharing stories of caring adults who take a risk of their own vulnerability. What we're talking about is a mentor. So what you recognize in a mentor, right? A person who can share with you some of the same experiences that you're experiencing now, some of the same traumas that you're currently dealing with. They can say, you know what? I was abused also as a child, right? They can say, I was shot when I was a child. Right? I come from a community like yours, and I'm a doctor now, and I made it out. Or I'm an athlete, I'm an NFL player, and I made it out. So begin to build that connection, a trusting relationship that has been lacking in that child's life, right? To encourage young people to dream and to imagine, to inspire them to see beyond the condition, event, or situation that caused trauma in the first place, instead of dwelling on, we're so sorry we're so sorry you were raped, right? We're so sorry you come from a broken home, right? Instead of saying that, we inspire them, encourage them to dream, to encourage them to dream outside of the ghetto, for example, that they may come from, right? To see the world as bigger than the environment that has impacted them and caused them trauma, right? To see a place in a world that they can envision. And so you begin to ask them questions, what do you want to be? Because we stop asking children this at certain points in life. We say, what do you want to be when you grow up? We ask them that at elementary school. And then when those children grow up just a little bit more and they start experiencing trauma, they start exhibiting behaviors that are not pleasurable to us, we don't ask them, who do you want to be anymore? We start asking, like, what's wrong with you? Why are you acting like this? Right? That's the question. Instead of still connecting with them, like, do you remember who you wanted to be when you were in the second grade? Remember when I came in your class and you were a first grader and you told me you wanted to be a doctor? Don't you remember that? Don't you still want to be a doctor? You know what I mean? Now that we're in the seventh grade and we're having that same conversation with them, right? We have to reinforce that, right? And build that encouragement in them. To build critical reflection and take loving action by helping young people develop an analysis of the political, social, and systemic practices that facilitated harm, and support them in responding to the political and policy decisions and practices that can exacerbate trauma, such as school walkouts, peace marches, promoting healthy school lunches, etc. This is a critical component that I experienced when I worked for the Student Advocacy Center in Michigan. We used to work with young folks that were experiencing high rates of suspension and expulsions. And then we became their advocates. We would advocate for them to stay in school, to stay engaged in the school, and work with the school system not to continue to suspend them, especially long term. Because the longer you are exposed to being out of school placement, the more likely you are to remain in out of school placement, more likely you are to become an alternative student, ultimately in contact with juvenile justice system, and ultimately in prison. So our method was to do this, to take young people, to teach them this very concept, to teach them about the social injustices that impact their lives, that have led to them being castigated or stigmatized as special education or alternative school placement, that their behaviors were stigmatized, etc. We would educate them on what's happened with the school system, what's happened in society that contribute to creating a school system that pathologize their behavior, right, and discipline them instead of find ways to cultivate them and raise them up to become better students, right? We'd educate them about that, teach them statistics about what's happening with the school to prison pipeline, and then we would then empower them, support them and empower them to react to the knowledge that they have now of what's happening that's created the conditions of harm in their life. So we would take the kids, for example, some of you were part of the work we did. We took some of the kids to the state capitol. I took a young man named Marcus Landenberger, for example, to go testify before the Senate committee in Lansing who were investigating suspensions and expulsions. Like, why are so many kids being suspended and what happened to those kids who are suspended? I took the student there, sat him before the Senate committee, and he testified. And you know one of the questions they asked him? When was the last time you were suspended? You know what his response was? I'm currently on suspension. can't go back to school till Tuesday. This was a Thursday. And he had already been out of school that whole week. Why was he suspended, they asked him? So why were you suspended? He said, somebody open that door, please. He said that while he was in the lunchroom, which is their shared gym, right? They have a gym in the lunchroom. They finish eating, they shoot basketball. Somebody shot the basketball bounced and hit someone who had their plate in their hand, and it knocked food on the floor. He was walking up at the same time to dump his plate. The school resource officer came in and seen the food on the floor and him at the garbage and told him to pick it up. He was like, it ain't mine. I didn't do it. So he told him to go to the office. So he got mad. Instead of going to the office, he went to his class. I ain't going to the office. Like, I ain't do nothing. I ain't getting in trouble. And instead of him going to the office, he was then punished and suspended from class. So one of the senators asked him, what did you do while you were on suspension? He said, stayed at home, played video games. So where's the lesson being taught to this young man who is now out of school placement, missing critical instruction, right? Missing the critical socialization that school produces, right? He's missing all these things, and he's not supported. So we educated them and trained them and supported them to then react to certain things, right? And so I'll give you another example. Just recently, when Governor Whitmer was running for a governor election, and she was having her last debate in Detroit, we organized our kids and took them to Detroit, and took them to the debate, and we held a rally outside the debate. So when Governor Gretchen Whitmer pulled up, she wasn't a governor yet, when she pulled up and seen these students with bullhorns, asking that their issues, that their concerns be heard by these candidates, Governor Gretchen Whitmer walked up to them, stood up with them, and got on the bullhorn and said, I'm here to support your issues. What are your issues? They said what their issues were. And she said, I'm going to make a commitment to them. I don't know if she's followed through with that commitment as of yet, but she came out and supported them, right? And stood side by side with them, right? So those are the things that can help reinforce the trauma that is impacting children in school and give them a sense to confront that trauma, right? And that's what the healing-centered engagement approach is all about. So we've gotten to the end